Welcome all to this Monterey Conversation. My name is Hanna Notte. I'm a senior associate with both the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and also with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at CSIS in Washington, D.C. And we are very fortunate to have with us today Rose Gottemoeller, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Now, over the past few weeks and against the backdrop of Russia's continued war against Ukraine, we've seen quite a few noteworthy developments in the nuclear sphere, which we'll discuss today. There's, of course, Russia's suspension of its participation in the New START treaty in late February. There's reports about enhanced Russian-Chinese cooperation in the nuclear domain. And then more recently, Russia's announcement to deploy non-strategic nuclear weapons to Belarus. I want to say just a few words about the format of today's event, at which we'll discuss these different issues. We are on the record today. We will go for about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And what we'll do is I'll have a conversation with Rose for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then we'll open it up to attendees to pose questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And I should also note that this event is co-convened by the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies and Russia Matters, which is a project of Harvard Kennedy's School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And the event is also made possible with the generous support of Carnegie Corporation of New York. Now, with that, let me introduce our distinguished guest today. Rose Gottemoeller is the Stephen C. Hasey Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Many of you will know this, but before joining Stanford, Rose was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. And prior to that, she served for nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the State Department. She was also, before that, an Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance in 2009-2010. And in that role, she was also the chief U.S. negotiator for the New START treaty with the Russian Federation. And before her government service, Rose was a senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she actually served as the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, I believe from 2006 to 2008. So very different times indeed. Welcome, Rose.
Thank you very much, Hanna. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
And let's begin and start perhaps with the New START treaty. We have quite a few eventful months behind us on that treaty, starting with the Russians first indefinitely postponing the meeting of the Bilateral Consultative Commission under the treaty in late November of last year, then increasingly explicitly linking the fate of the treaty to the United States support for Ukraine and essentially holding the treaty hostage over that situation. And then, of course, we get to late February and President Putin announcing that Russia would suspend its participation in the treaty. So I want to start by asking you where we are today. I mean, the United States, I believe, notified Russia in late March that it would no longer share certain data itself. Then there was some confusion about what the Russians would still share, whether they would still notify the US about ballistic missile launches. So to the best of our knowledge, where are we today with what the two sides are still doing? And how do you see the overall situation?
On a U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control hit a wall with Vladimir Putin's suspension of the New START treaty on February 21st of this year. You are right. The Russians had been nibbling away at it for some time. I think trying, as I read the Russian interagency, trying to balance demands from the Kremlin for leverage against the United States with, I think, a real wish to continue with implementation of the treaty. That's my reading of the situation in Moscow. But of course, when the president of the country demands an end to treaty implementation, then in that case, and in this case, particularly with the authoritarian state that exists in Russia nowadays, that is the result that we are seeing today, with the Russian government desperately trying to rationalize its decision to suspend New START. It's a completely illegal as well as egregious action from the perspective of the United States. And what puzzles me the most is that it doesn't serve Russian national security interests. The United States is about to embark on a 2-decade modernization of our strategic nuclear force posture. So this is the exact time when the Russian Federation should want to keep the United States under limits. But in this case, as you noted, I think that they were really, and Vladimir Putin himself was desperately grasping at levers against the United States and to try to punish the United States for its cooperation and support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. So that is where things stand today. As normal, though, I see, possibilities for the future. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation this morning to perhaps develop some of those with you.
That's great. Thank you. And I want to come to an article that you published together with Marshall Brown in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, I think quite shortly after the Russian suspension, in which you sort of dissected the Russian decision from a legal perspective. And on that basis, you gave recommendations for US policy. You suggested, for instance, that Russia's suspension of the treaty does not jeopardize what you call US supreme interests. And therefore, the Russian suspension shouldn't compel the US to withdraw from the treaty. And you also argued that the US should consider continuing to share some information as a gesture both to Russia, but also to the broader international community. Now, it's been 6 weeks since you both wrote that piece, and I want to ask you whether you still stand by your analysis and your recommendations or whether anything has changed.
Yes, absolutely, Hanna. I do stand by those, and I believe my co-author, Marshall Brown, who's an excellent treaty lawyer. I was very glad to have him as co-author. But as a matter of fact, I think one of the key points in that piece is that the United States and Russian Federation still have a legal relationship under the New START treaty, because the Russians did not withdraw from the treaty, so the treaty continues in force. And indeed, the Russian Federation has said that it will continue to abide by the limits of the treaty. The United States, of course, will continue to abide by the limits of the treaty at this time. So I think that legal relationship is something that we should consider now as we look to options for the future. Marshall Brown and I argue in the piece, for example, that during this period, this strange kind of period when the treaty is still in force but is not being properly implemented by the Russians, that we should still do everything we can to ensure that we are not creating conditions for the treaty not to be able to enter into force. I'm sorry, to return to full implementation. It is in force, of course, but so that is one of the reasons why I was arguing that, and Marshall Brown were arguing that it's important to continue to convey that the United States has every intention of continuing with full implementation of the treaty, whereas, of course, we are not obliged to provide everything to the Russians that they are now not providing to us. The Russians are providing notifications, but it's under the 1988 Launch Notification Agreement. It's not under the New START Treaty, and they have clearly suspended all notifications as well as data exchange under the New START Treaty. We argue that we should think judiciously, and in fact, I'm quite impressed with what the United States government has done so far, thinking judiciously about what steps to take to really convey to the Russians, to send a clear message that what they are doing is not correct, is illegal, in fact, and therefore we have ourselves suspended data exchange for the time being, but have also continued notifications of the status of our strategic nuclear forces. to my mind, this is a very important gesture at a time when the Kremlin has been rattling the nuclear saber constantly. The United States needs to be sending a clear message that we are a responsible nuclear actor and will remain so. And we want the Russians to have predictability about what's going on in our strategic nuclear force posture. So I think the decision of the United States to continue notifications for the time being is a judicious one.
Thanks for that. I do want to shift gears slightly for a moment, because when I read that piece in the bulletin and the legal analysis, which shows how Russia uses references both to international law, but also to its own federal law in order to justify this suspension of its participation in New START, I couldn't help but see some sort of distant parallels to the handling of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, because in that instance, at the OPCW, Russia has essentially argued, again with reference to its own national legislation, that it cannot proceed with investigating the Navalny poisoning, that would contradict its own laws. And you also noted in the article that the legal argumentation over New START recalls what Russia did when it suspended its implementation of the CFE treaty in 2007. And so this sort of made me think, when Russia engages in what Western states would certainly consider rogue actions in the arms control domain, it essentially uses one of three tools. It outright denies any wrongdoing, such as violating the INF treaty. To that, Russia has never admitted. It points to American precedent, such as with the recent announcement of nuclear deployments to Belarus. Or the third option is it engages in this sort of legal obfuscation, or possibly also in disinformation, to either justify or to mask its own actions. How can Western states deal with these kinds of tactics? And do you think that what's been tried so far to counter these tactics has been successful? I realize this is a sort of broader picture question about how to deal with Russia on these issues.
As in any case of disinformation or misinformation, Hanna, I think the most important thing is to shine a light on it and as clearly as possible convey to the broad global community just how wrong the approach is. And in each of those three areas that you outlined, I think the United States has done its best. Certainly the history at the OPCW and what the United States has done, not only in the Navalny case, but also in the Skripal case, and the case of chemical weapons use by the Syrian government, covered up by the Russian Federation. I think the United States has done a masterful job at the OPCW in conveying to the OPCW community and the world at large how wrong the approach of the Russian Federation has been. So I think it's very important to be consistent, to be clear, and really to be quite open and shine a light on these issues. If I may just comment for a moment on the last point about Russian domestic law taking precedent. Of course, I'm no lawyer, but as I understand the Vienna Convention law on treaties and established international practice, international law, treaty law is supposed to be the highest law of the international community and is supposed to take precedent over domestic law. That is why I've been quite concerned, and you saw it in Russia's suspension of the New START treaty, that they referred to their own law on treaties that was passed, I believe, about a decade ago, wherein they say that now their domestic law can take precedent and will take precedent when it's in, there's vague wording, when it's in Russia's national interest to suspend treaties. And to my mind, this is one of the most dangerous aspects of this whole thing, that Russia is now declaring that this well-established international legal view that international treaty law takes precedent over domestic law, in fact, is superseded by this current Russian approach and by the domestic law that was passed about a decade ago.
Very interesting. Thanks for adding that. I wasn't aware of that nuance. But I want to come back to.
If I could just one second,
Yeah.
You noted that they passed a law. They carefully passed a law in the Duma and the Federation Council to proclaim that their national security interests were being undermined by New START. And now the reference is to return to implementation of New START will have to require a Duma and Federation Council decision, I presume, to essentially overturn that law. So they're creating national barriers to moving forward.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I want to come back to sort of what the intention here is on the Russian side with the suspension. And so you sort of hinted at your own reading of the situation a bit earlier, this possibility that this is really a Russian exercise in leverage. They want to tighten the screws. They want to drive up the costs to the United States for supporting Ukraine, but they remain essentially interested in the treaty. They will continue to abide by its central limits. And then according to that reading, I suppose, the hope is that they will also eventually return to the table, also because they have no interest in entering a new arms race, whether before or after 2026, when the treaty expires. But there's also a second reading, and that is the possibility that the Russians have already adopted a sort of post-New START mindset. And since they view themselves in not just a confrontation with the United States and the West over Ukraine, but really a systemic confrontation, they are in fact prepared for a world without these kinds of guardrails in the nuclear domain. Can you just elaborate a little more why you remain in the sort of more positive camp in terms of reading Russian intentions here?
Well, I remain in the national interest camp, and countries don't enter into treaties because they're nice to have. They enter into treaties because they are in their national security interest. And as I stated at the outset, I view it in Russia's national security interest to continue to have mutual limitations on strategic nuclear forces because of, and you referred to it yourself, the advent potentially of arms racing and the uncontrolled essentially resource expenditure that could lead to at a time when Russia itself, now I know everyone is saying that Russia will be depending more on its nuclear forces, and no doubt that is true for some period, but that is not the most advantageous security posture to be in. One does need capable conventional forces as well. And in this case, the Russian Federation will have to rebuild its conventional forces after this terrible war in Ukraine. So, just looking at it as a resource matter and where is the money going to come from for unbridled arms racing? I think that is a question that must be asked in the Kremlin, as it will be asked in every other nuclear capital. I hope in Beijing as well. But in any event, it is an open debate, and I welcome the debate. I think it's important to look at all of the options at the moment because, as I said, nuclear arms control seems to have hit a wall at the moment. So we need to consider what all of the options are for the future.
Thanks for that. I do have one sort of last question on the New START situation and where we go from there. So I recall for much of the last year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we in the arms control community, when we were discussing what might still be possible between the United States and Russia, we considered the question of sequencing. So what would need to come first in order to move forward? Is it a ceasefire in Ukraine? And there was a lot of talk last summer from the Biden administration about a quote unquote goodwill gesture by the Russians. Or is it resumption of on-site inspections under the New START treaty? What needs to happen before we could resume the strategic stability dialogue, SSD, between the United States and Russia, which for those who listen and are not familiar with it is the sort of format in which both sides wanted to also discuss a follow-on agreement to supersede or to take the place of New START when it expires. Now, obviously, since we've been having those discussions, so much has happened. We have the suspension of New START, but we also are in a situation where it seems to me, at least, a ceasefire in Ukraine is sort of fundamentally out of reach for the moment. So I want to ask you, what's your sense of the required choreography that's now required to untangle this whole mess? And I'm asking you, Rose, because it's my sense, and this is sort of purely intuition, my gut feeling, sort of reading the situation, that Russia might no longer be interested really in discussing anything with the United States until it can have this larger conversation with the US on what it views as its security interests in Europe. So the kinds of things that Russia tabled in the quote unquote draft treaties before invading Ukraine. So Russia essentially wants a sort of SSD 2.0, if you wish, with a vastly expanded agenda before even considering returning into the New START treaty. Now, this is just my reading. It might be incorrect, but I assume that would be a total non-starter for the Biden administration. So I'm just curious where you see the sort of the choreography here and in terms of how things need to proceed.
Wow, we're a long way away from strategic stability talks, Hanna, and we are, as you, I think, clearly point out, far away from a negotiated solution to the Ukraine crisis. And I want to state unequivocally at this point that, in my view, that must be driven by Kyiv. It must be driven by the views of the Ukrainian government as to where things stand in their conflict with Russia. And they must be the ones who bring us to the negotiating table if they want us there in negotiating with Russia. So I am clearly in the view that Kyiv, with regard to the resolution of the war in Ukraine, must be in the driver's seat. But I've argued elsewhere that the United States has a responsibility as one of the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and one of the 2 largest nuclear weapon states at this moment, along with the Russian Federation. If Russia's not going to play, we have a continuing responsibility to try to do everything we can to bring down the nuclear temperature because of Putin's egregious saber rattling in the first instance, but now, as you pointed out at the outset, because of additional actions that are going on, such as the evident movement of nuclear capable delivery vehicles and perhaps warheads also to Belarus. So, this is the top line U.S. responsibility from my point of view. And so the United States should be looking for opportunities in the first instance just to keep lines of communication open with Russia so we can try to discern what their interests are, where their interests lie at the moment. I'm not sure exactly what they are looking for at the moment, but I do note that there's been an interesting trend line in Russian public discourse in the last week to 10 days, and that is to begin to talk about what agreements continue to remain in force. There was an interesting article by Elena Chernenko in Kommersant last week that picked out half a dozen agreements that continue to be enforced, such as the 1973 Avoidance of Nuclear War Agreement, and also, of course, they refer again to the 1988 Launch Notification Agreement, with the notion that these are still available for consultation, that we could use them as a mechanism for continuing to communicate. Well, I welcome that gesture, but I think we're going to have to hear a little more from Moscow about what they have in mind in terms of consultation at this moment, because that range of agreements that they note are still in force very, very quite a bit. And what exactly is their interest at this moment? What would be their agenda? So I am hopeful that we will hear a bit more from Moscow about what they would like to be talking about at this moment. But I'm not sure that it has only to do with the situation, the security situation in Europe. But let me, as I wrap up this response, say that I do think it will be necessary as we come out of this war between Russia and Ukraine. I think it will be necessary to look very hard at the European security arrangements that were built under the so-called Helsinki process and led to the OSCE, Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Vienna document, the Open Skies Treaty, the whole panoply of conventional arms control regimes is also in tatters, thanks to the Russian Federation. But I do think we need to take a good hard look at that set of European security arrangements as well. And I hope that there will be some creative thinking in our community about that matter.
Thanks for that, Rose. You mentioned Belarus, so I want to turn to that situation there and the recent announcement by Russia to deploy non-strategic nuclear weapons there. You served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Can you just give the listeners and viewers a sense of how serious of a threat potentially this Russian decision is for NATO allies, especially in the East?
One way of looking at it is that Russian warheads are already close to NATO borders. When one thinks about the potential for Russia to quickly bring warheads to Kaliningrad to enhance delivery, they already have very capable delivery vehicles there that are well within the range of all NATO capitals. That was one of the reasons NATO was so very worried about the so-called 9M729, the ground-launched cruise missile, nuclear-armed, that the Russians deployed in violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. So the Russians have very capable delivery vehicles in Kaliningrad. They are designed to carry nuclear warheads. So from a certain perspective, bringing warheads to Belarus does not make a big difference, except in my mind, it really undermines the letter and the spirit of the trilateral statement with Belarus that brought Belarus into the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. And Belarus even had that non-nuclear status inscribed in its constitution, of course, now overturned by the Lukashenko government. By the action of the Belarusian parliament, but at the instigation of the Lukashenko government. So I think that there are many reasons to be quite concerned about what is going on in Belarus, and it's both conventional and nuclear. The Russians have been using Belarus as a launch pad for their operations into Ukraine, and the notion that they now have both nuclear and conventional options available to them in Belarus, of course, must be concerning to the Ukrainians and to NATO as a whole. But one final point on this, again, nuclear weapons have rested close to the border with Ukraine from the very outset of this conflict. The Belgorod central storage facility is, as I understand it, about 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. So there already are Russian nuclear weapons very close to the borders of Ukraine as well.
Thanks for that, Rose. I want to turn a little bit to the international reaction to this announcement. I believe it was on March 31st that the Ukrainians called for a debate at the UN Security Council, sort of extraordinary session on that planned Belarus deployment. And when I looked at the transcript of that debate, it struck me that we didn't see so much strong condemnations from countries in what you could call the global south or countries from the non-aligned movement, countries which have frankly criticized NATO's practice of nuclear sharing for a long time. So I think, a country like Ecuador was quite outspoken, actually condemning the Russian decision. And Brazil said that two wrongs do not make one right. But otherwise, I don't think we've heard so much sort of alarm or condemnation from that part of the world. I want to ask you what your take is on that and how you think this issue will play into upcoming multilateral nuclear diplomacy. We have the PrepCom of the NPT, for instance, coming up in Vienna in August.
Right. Well, here is a case, we were talking about Russian disinformation, misinformation at the outset. Here is a case where I believe that Russia has been winning the information war in the global south, and channels like RT are very, very popular in the global south overall. And so the stories and the lines of argument that RT and other Russian media sources put out are ones that I think are frequently taken up in the global south, and that is something that I point to the United States and say, look, you have to be better at this. You have to be more aware of these other media audiences and be working as hard as certainly harder, I would say, than the Russians do at getting our side of the story out. So that's part of the problem there. But also, I think there is a longstanding aspect to this that is associated with the non-aligned movement and the kind of reaction to colonial past. I really have been quite struck that here is a case where Russian aggression against Ukraine and really this profound attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine by a Russian aggressor is not necessarily seen as being of concern or of interest to the global South. And here is a case, I think, where they remember the imperial past and really that whole set of emotions as well as policies and viewpoints that were at the root of the formation of the non-aligned movement. So I think that we are also seeing echoes of that Cold War past in the situation that exists today. And the way, again, I think to counter it is for the United States and for the NATO allies to work as hard as possible to get out information that really shows what the history was. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated by the USSR and the United States, as well as UK and other countries in leadership roles. And at the time, the USSR was very keen to see the NATO nuclear sharing arrangements take shape, because they were very concerned that other NATO countries would acquire nuclear weapons, would develop nuclear weapons. They were particularly concerned about Germany acquiring nuclear weapons. This was in the period of the mid to late 1960s. And so the USSR not only acquiesced, but was part of the negotiation of those articles of the NPT that really convey consent to that nuclear sharing arrangement. So it's to me, it's a great irony, but the Russian government, as it is today, is flipping that on its head and saying that NATO nuclear sharing is illegal and a violation of the NPT. That's not the way the Soviet government saw it in 1967.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. I want to again shift gears slightly and ask you about the current nuclear escalation risks in this war and more broadly between Russia and NATO. Because it seems to me that we've had these waves of nuclear saber rattling by the Russian government over the past year, sort of implicit or perhaps more explicit nuclear threats. And I recall certainly sitting in Europe, sitting in Berlin, that the wider public was incredibly alarmed, especially at the beginning of the war. I would get calls from friends, who I hadn't heard from in years since going to school, who knew, okay, I'm now working for an arms control think tank. How serious is this risk of nuclear escalation? It was sort of very prominent on media, on television. And then it sort of ebbed and it recurred at certain points in the war. We had the annexation of 4 territories in late September. And at that point, another sort of resurfacing of the perception of the nuclear threat. But perhaps we have also had this feeling seeping in. And again, now I'm speaking about Europe, that Russia announces red lines and then it doesn't really act on them. So fighting has continued in those 4 annexed territories. There have been singular attacks even on Crimea. There have been sort of raids across the Russian border, and nothing has happened. And so I want to ask you whether you are concerned in any way that we, both governments and publics, are becoming somehow numb to the danger of nuclear escalation and of nuclear use. And if that is the case, then how does one deal with that, or what does that mean?
Right. Well, I think the first thing that we have to count on is the evidence. And here the United States and the UK government have both been very good at continuing to say that we see no evidence of an enhanced nuclear readiness posture by the Russian either strategic nuclear forces and also, to the degree it can be known, the non-strategic nuclear weapons that might be used in a Ukraine scenario. So I think we have to continue to depend on how much information we can get that is really fact-based again and coming from official sources like the US government and the UK government. Before I dive into this, I just wanted to tell a tiny vignette, if I may, that your remark that a lot of your friends were asking all of a sudden. I had a surgery 2 years ago now, and last March, just after the war had started, I went back to my surgeon, my orthopedic surgeon. He was checking on my hip replacement, and after he had me walk up and down the hall and said, "Okay, you look fine," he brought me into his office and he said, "What's going on? Are we going to have a nuclear war with Russia?" And so, and I get like taxi drivers asking me this question. I don't know why they ask me. They don't even know I work in the nuclear arena, but I get asked this question all the time. So I think one thing is I actually welcome the fact that the public is now more alive to the nuclear threat and seems to be thinking about it more. I hope that this will spell a greater attention to and a greater governmental involvement and engagement, as well as public engagement and involvement in the NPT review process, including in the upcoming PrepCom, because I think the public is newly alive to the threats of nuclear use, and in that I disagree a bit. I think people are numb. Yes, they are numb a bit, but it is a numbness that is bathed in the notion that there could really be an ongoing nuclear threat that we have to be aware of. And so there is, as always, I tend to be somewhat positive in my take on things, but I hope that this new public awareness will pay dividends for the NPT review process. That said, I also am concerned about a kind of cry wolf thing that's going on with the Russians. You are right, again and again, they have let putative red lines be crossed, and nevertheless, they continue to issue threats, but they do not take any nuclear action. I welcome that very much. I think that there are potentially some reasons why they don't take actions that are beyond the war in Ukraine and their fear of escalation. I think at the end of the day, it's fear of escalation into a war with the NATO alliance that holds them back. But I think that there are some other factors as well. For example, I've watched with interest Vladimir Putin raging against the so-called nuclear taboo and pointing a finger at the United States for the only use of nuclear weapons in wartime at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Well, he may rage against that fact that there is such a strong nuclear taboo, but in fact, I think that the Russian government and Putin himself does not at the moment have an interest in seeing that moral burden of nuclear use in wartime shifting to the shoulders of Putin himself and to the Russian government and the Russian people. So I do think that there are a number of factors that are holding them back at the moment, but I continue to be very, very worried that should Putin feel his back against the wall in this war, that there could be still a nuclear use of some kind. I still do not think it would be a strategic nuclear use, but I think any nuclear use carries with it the grave concern of escalation. And so I'm very worried about what the possibilities might be here for the future. So I think we must try everything we can, as I said, to bring the nuclear temperature down. But primarily, I see doing that at the moment involves trying to keep every line of communication open with Moscow that we can.
Thanks, Rose. I suppose another factor that is sometimes being pointed to at keeping Russia from going in that direction of nuclear use is China and Chinese leverage over Russia. We haven't talked very much about China today, so I want to come to China for a little bit. There's been quite a bit of reporting in recent months about enhanced, deepening nuclear cooperation between Russia and China. For example, reports of Russia supplying highly enriched uranium for China's fast breeder reactors, which is a concern for the United States because the Chinese need more plutonium in order to expand their nuclear forces. And I think the Chinese defense minister, the new one, is in Moscow actually today, again, to talk about enhanced military defense cooperation between the two countries. So I want to ask you how concerned you are about the nuclear cooperation between the two countries, to the extent that you can share some thoughts with us. What's your estimation regarding the nature and the scope of that cooperation going forward and what it means for the United States?
Of course, in historical terms, it was the Soviet Union that helped the Chinese to launch their nuclear weapons program in the first place, and that didn't turn out so well. They ended up coming to the brink of nuclear conflict themselves in the border war that they had in the 1968 time period. So I think that any cooperation between Moscow and Beijing in this arena should be informed by that past situation where they almost came to nuclear blows after some period of cooperation. So viewing it from a historian's perspective, I would like to sound that note of caution. At the same time, we have known for a long time about Russia supporting the breeder reactor program in China with the sale of highly enriched uranium. And I know the United States and others have been conveying very clearly concerns that this could support the production of plutonium in China for an expanded nuclear warhead arsenal. Of course, China and Russia say that this is all for peaceful purposes, et cetera, but it's ridiculous. So I think we will need to keep up the drumbeat of concern about this. Again, keep the spotlight shone on this particular cooperation and see what we can do to get the international community joining in pressure against this. You know, it wasn't so long ago I was trying to work with other P5 colleagues, the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, of course, UK, France, US, China, and Russia, the P5, trying to work to launch a fissile material cutoff treaty negotiation. That seems like a distant possibility at the moment, but I think the notion of constraints on fissile material production need to continue to be front and center in terms of NPT policy for the P5. And I welcome the fact that the United States, at least for the moment, continues its moratorium on fissile material production. But if there continues to be a major buildup of warhead potential in Russia, and Russia already has plenty of potential, but in China as well, then this is going to be a situation where the United States is going to have to take a second look as well. So I do think that we are at an inflection point at the moment, and this is something that we must be very, very concerned about. So I hope it will be an issue going forward, both for the NPT community as a whole, but also for the P5.
Thanks, Rose. We have about half an hour left for this conversation. I do have one last question for you for the moment, but I also want to encourage participants to start posing their questions to Rose Gottemoeller in the Q&A function, and then I will read the questions out to Rose. But yes, as people gather their thoughts and write down their questions, let me ask you a final question. I cannot not mention your book in this conversation, Negotiating the New START Treaty, which was published in 2021. And I want to ask you, I mean, you've engaged with Russian counterparts for such a long time. You negotiated the New START Treaty with Russian counterparts. Of all the things that you learned doing this job, what can be most helpful and instructive for the very difficult situation that we are in today?
First of all, let me say that I have great respect for Soviet and Russian diplomacy. They are extraordinarily well-trained, extraordinarily disciplined, and also they can be extraordinarily creative in problem-solving, again, depending on what their overarching instructions are from on high. So I have great admiration for Russian diplomats, but I also note that when their instructions are instructions that are not productive from our perspective, they carry them out with supreme discipline. And it makes it very, very difficult then to open up a conversation. So we are at that moment. I will say that, and it's key not only to talking with the Russians, but to negotiating with anyone, is to try to understand their human side and to get to their human side in order to be able to communicate more at a clear and unimpeded level. And I talk about different ways that I undertook to do that in the book. Small and very, very slight gestures can pay big dividends. I talk in the book, for example, about how when the Russian hockey team at the Vancouver Olympics took a drubbing from the Canadians, the next day everyone from me on down, has expressed sympathy to the Russian delegation about that big loss. And even the crustiest and most difficult members, military and intelligence members of the Russian delegation, responded in a positive way to that small gesture. So I just want to convey to the listeners today that it's sometimes the smallest human gesture that can make a real difference. But they have to have some running room. They have to have some ability to be flexible and creative. And when the Kremlin instructions are so strict and give so little room for maneuver, of course, their national and I would say training discipline will mean that they can't do much. But nevertheless, we need to continue to try to broaden the aperture and try to look for areas where there can be some flexibility for true consultation and discussion, which is why, getting back to our earlier point, that they've now kind of publicly listed other agreements beyond New START where they are thinking about, I suppose, as a one way to put it, the possibilities of consultation. I think we need to probe that opening.
Thank you, Rose. I'll go to our questions that are coming in. We actually had a question that arrived to us by email even before this event by Major Alex Carley, who's at the United States European Command. And he had questions about conventional arms control, which we haven't discussed so much today. So there's one question about how the relationship between conventional arms control and nuclear arms control has changed since the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, if at all. And then also to add to that, what are the limits of the US self-adhering and reporting to legacy arms control agreements like the CFE Treaty and the Vienna document? Are there any perks, for example, with international credibility and alliance cohesion?
Yes, those are excellent questions, Major Carley, and thank you for those. I would say, as I mentioned at the outset, I've been concerned for many years about Russian destructive behavior with regard to the European conventional arms control regimes. The Russians, and I see, frankly, a set of precedents that were established in Russian suspension of the CFE Treaty in 2007 that they have now applied to their suspension of the START Treaty in 2023. So the Russians have been undermining the conventional arms and security regimes in Europe now for many, many years. And so I really do believe that we are going to have some very hard work ahead of us to try to redeem any aspects of the Helsinki process in whatever new era emerges after the war in Ukraine is resolved. We will have some very, very hard work to do. But I continue to believe that it pays dividends for the United States to continue to implement the CFE Treaty, for example. CFE has been an important mechanism for the remaining signatories to maintain some security and stability in Europe. I note, for example, that it has at times been useful in the crisis in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the fact that they have continued to implement CFE, not perfectly, of course, and there have been problems there, but nevertheless, there continues to be some mutual predictability and transparency that emerges from the CFE regime that pays dividends elsewhere, not only in the relationship with Russia. So I think that it behooves the United States to continue action to exchange data. I've been concerned at the recent attitude of the United States in this regard. I think that the United States should be doing everything it can to ensure that whatever remains of the conventional arms control regimes in Europe continue to be able to pay those security dividends, as perhaps slight they may seem, juxtaposed against this tremendous bloody war in Ukraine. But nevertheless, we must continue to be concerned about crisis and instability in other areas of Europe as well. And I think those regimes continue to play a good role there.
Thank you, Rose. I have another question related to China. I mean, we talked about the concern regarding nuclear cooperation with Russia. We haven't talked so much about how you engage the Chinese in nuclear arms control. And we have Robert Andrew asking, assuming that the US and Russia can get back to the nuclear negotiating table, should we attempt to get China into nuclear weapons agreements as well? So the three countries in a sort of new start. And how concerned should we be with the Chinese nuclear forces growing? How do you see the future of arms control with China? Big question.
Yes, it is a big question. And let me come to that in a moment. But one thing I did want to mention regarding your earlier question about Russia-China cooperation, I actually have been glad that so far this whole nuclear threatening behavior of the Russian Federation, this is an area where the Chinese President Xi Jinping has taken a clear and unequivocal public stance, backed up then by the performance of his government in saying that nuclear weapons should not be part of the mix in this war in Ukraine. Xi Jinping, along with Prime Minister Modi of India, back in November of last year at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Kazakhstan, they both spoke very clearly and publicly in a reproving manner in Vladimir Putin's presence, saying that nuclear weapons should not be part of the calculus, Russia's calculus in Ukraine. And I think that was very valuable, and I welcome it very much. And it continues to be backed up by, so far, at least by the stance of the Chinese government. So I think that is extremely, extremely valuable. But turning to the question, I have long thought that, yes, of course, we need to get China to the negotiating table because they are building up their nuclear weapons rapidly. But more importantly than that, to my mind, is the fact that they're building up nuclear-capable delivery vehicles very rapidly, that in both a nuclear and conventional way, because most of these new missile systems are dual-capable, they can threaten U.S. force posture in the Indo-Pacific and particularly U.S. naval assets. So, of course, we need to try to get the Chinese to the table to talk about, in the first instance, what they're up to. What are their intentions? What is their strategy and doctrine with regard to these buildups that they're undertaking, both of nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles? And so let's get some mutual predictability in that way. I guess one could call them strategic stability talks. I know that is a little bit of a poison pill right now, but I think that really mutual predictability needs to be the goal of any discussions between the United States and China at this moment, in the first instance. I also have long thought that we should be looking for areas where the Chinese already have some equality of capability, and that will in turn engender, back to my original point, a national security interest in Beijing in coming to the negotiating table, because they, of course, will see they have something to bargain with against U.S. Weapons capability coming into their theater. And here, primarily, I think I would start, frankly, with some negotiation over intermediate range delivery vehicles, again, that threaten U.S. not only potentially naval forces, but also that threaten U.S. and allied operational bases in the Indo-Pacific. So, and here the Chinese have a great array of capability that is developed, and they may, as I say, have some negotiating room in this regard as the United States prepares to deploy its own conventionally armed ground-launched cruise missile. I took note back on February 4th of 2022 when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met in Beijing, and they had their great powwow where they agreed their friendship without limits and so forth and so on. Their long declaration, 6,000-word declaration that day, had a reference to the moratorium that on INF systems that Putin proposed in Europe, which I think is worth exploring, not the original proposal, but the so-called refreshed proposal from October 2020. Yeah, I think that it's worthwhile to have a look at that proposal. So I could agree with that part of the U.S.-Chinese joint statement. But also I was quite interested that the two presidents talked about extending such a moratorium to Asia. And I think that's well worth exploring. What did the Chinese mean by that? And Moscow and Beijing pledged to continue to consult on this matter. So what has their consultation produced so far? I'd like to know more about that as well. So in other words, I would start in an area where there is equality of capability, because the Chinese are still building up their nuclear potential. At the moment, they have approximately 500 warheads against the 4,000 to 5,000 that the United States and Russia each have. So in my mind, we have some room to prepare negotiations with them on the nuclear front, strategic nuclear front, but we should concentrate our efforts elsewhere to begin with, not only potentially on INF, but on, for example, space-based assets as well.
Thank you for that, Rose. We have another question by Umar Ahmad, which zooms out a little bit and just asks simply what the most pressing issues are that need to be addressed in order to enhance nuclear security and strategic stability today between Russia and the US. And I might add, without a New START treaty being fully functional, is it in the area of nuclear risk reduction, or what's sort of most pressing now?
Well, I do welcome the fact that the P5 process, this is the process that's existed for over a decade now among the nuclear weapons states under the NPT, but the P5 process embraced the notion of risk reduction that emerged out of the NPT review conference last year in August. And so the P5 have been evidently quietly talking about risk reduction and perhaps beginning to develop some agenda of joint cooperation there. We already have a lot of risk reduction mechanisms that exist. For example, the nuclear hotline between Moscow and Washington has existed since the Cuban Missile Crisis in the mid-1960s, and that continues, of course, to operate. But there are other communication links that continue to operate, such as the link that is called the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center in the U.S., the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center between Moscow and Washington. So I think for the P5 to continue to talk about the history of such communications mechanisms and to talk about ways to both expand them among the P5, but also to ensure their viability no matter what happens in terms of potential conflict and the need for redundancy and resilience with regard to communication links. These are all quite practical topics, and they should be ones that the P5 can engage in, even in the midst of this terrible war in Ukraine. So I do hope that interaction will continue to bear fruit, and I do think it's a very important direction of travel at this moment when not much else is possible.
Thanks, Rose. Matt Hagengruber wants to probe you a little further on this rationale for the United States to continue to provide notifications under the New START treaty. He asks, should the US continue to do that? Doesn't our doing so, while Russia no longer does, reward Russia for its bad behavior? Or are we doing it to signal to other treaty partners that we keep our word even when others don't? Perhaps you could just elaborate again a little more on the argument for continued transparency.
Yes, I really believe that the United States must be on the moral high ground at this moment. Just because the Russians are behaving badly doesn't mean that we should behave badly as well. And in fact, I think we should do everything we can to convey to the international community the fact that we are fulfilling our treaty responsibilities here, and we continue to stand for the international rule of law. And again, that somehow domestic whim or domestic law cannot supersede international law. And I do believe that is a very important message for the United States to convey at this moment. But also, as I stated at the outset, I think that there is a particular strategic rationale here, and that is during this period when Russia is rattling the nuclear saber and behaving in such unpredictable nuclear behavior, that it behooves the United States to do everything we can to continue to signal that we are not intent on such a path ourselves. In fact, we are intent on the path of nuclear stability and bringing down the nuclear temperature. And so continuing to provide to Russia the news that our nuclear posture has not changed and that we continue to operate in a routine manner, to my mind, is really providing major strategic benefits to the United States. We need to continue to convey that message in every way we can. We've done it in other ways. For example, when the Russians first invaded Ukraine, we postponed ICBM test launches. That was a good step, and I thought was a very good way to convey that we are not the ones who are rattling the nuclear saber, that it's coming out of Moscow. So I think we have an interest in continuing to convey that message clearly and unequivocally to Moscow in the first instance, but also to the international community.
Thank you for that, Rose. I thought that Grace Smith put an interesting question also in the chat. She says, we think it's in Russia's national interest to avoid an arms race and that they're not going to consider going forward after 2026 with no guardrails in the nuclear domain. But is there any support for the view that Russia may see this differently? This gets back to sort of my earlier question about Russian intentions. And I suppose, these hints about possibly resuming nuclear testing. I don't know how you view those, but perhaps I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, well, when I look at it, I come back to my answer about the resource choices that any country has to make. And in this case, the Russian Federation is coming out of this, once this terrible war finally ends, it will be coming out of this war in a very, well, I would say, how best to express it, in a very difficult economic situation, with economic crisis really bathing the country in so many ways. Of course, it's in many ways a command economy, and so they can throw money at guns rather than at butter. So I'm not talking about that trade-off, but I am talking about the trade-off they will need to make between simple reliance on nuclear weapons and a nuclear buildup versus rebuilding their conventional armed forces, which they will have to do because so much has been destroyed in Ukraine. So I do think that there's a kind of practical limit in terms of the resources that Russia will have available for nuclear buildup. And in that context, I think that they would and should have an interest in limits on the United States in the course of the U.S. nuclear modernization, because the U.S. does not have that kind of economic crisis and limits on its ability to invest in defense. Already the United States invests vastly more in defense than do many other countries put together. So to my mind, the United States, of course, spends the vast majority of those funds on its conventional force posture. But to my mind, the notion that the United States would be unlimited in its nuclear resources, I think is something that the Russians should be thinking very, very hard about. So, of course, and I've had Russians say to me, you cannot tell me what our national interests are. I understand that, of course, but looking in from the outside, I don't see a good outcome for Russia arms racing with the United States, nuclear arms racing with the United States. I just don't see a good outcome there.
Thank you, Rose. We do have 5 to 10 minutes left for this event. So anyone who still wants to ask a question, I encourage you to type it into the Q&A function now. But we do have a few questions from Sienna Parrish. Rose, I'm not sure whether you can see them yourself in the box, but some of them go a little bit beyond the remit of our conversation. But one is basically about, can we see Putin still as a rational actor? And perhaps if we can't, then what does that mean? Another relates to how the US plans on moving forward when this war ends, if Putin is still in power at that time. And then there's also a broader question about what it means for the global response to Russia's actions if China continues to be on Russia's side and China has considerable sway over, for instance, the African continent, giving debt diplomacy. So these are some of the questions posed by Sienna. If you want to address some of those, that would be great.
Yes, a very good, very complex question, Sienna. I think we could probably spend another hour and 15 minutes on your questions alone, but I will try to say a few things about them. I think, as I see it, the biggest issue, and I can't know. No one can know what's going on in Vladimir Putin's mind, but we've all watched over the past 2 years, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, a kind of isolation developing in the Kremlin, a kind of barrier wall. And I think we all suspect that very little information that is not coming from Putin's immediate circle gets through that barrier wall. So whether or not he's a rational actor, is he getting the information that he needs to make good decisions on behalf of the Russian people? I'm not saying that he will see Russian interests as we see our own interests, of course, but I think, to my mind, that's the biggest question out there. Is Vladimir Putin so isolated that he's not capable of really seeing the situation as it really is and making good decisions on that basis? But again, I want to underscore, I'm not saying that U.S. interests and Russian interests are going to coincide. That's not possible. But I do see continuing areas where our interests should coincide, and that particularly includes nuclear stability and mutual nuclear predictability, as we are the two largest nuclear weapon states. So I tend to focus my thinking in that area and continue to believe, as the Russians evidently do not at this point, but I continue to believe that the United States and Russia have a special responsibility to ensure that we do not end up in a nuclear catastrophe, that we do not end up in a nuclear holocaust. And that is, to my mind, a top line national responsibility in both Russia and the U.S. If Russia's not going to behave in that way, then it is the U.S. that must continue to be the leader in trying to prevent nuclear holocaust in every way we can. And as I said, bring the nuclear temperature down. So as to your other question, I think, of course, everyone is quite anxious about whether Russia and China will join forces. There are so many parts and pieces to this puzzle that I will only say a few things. I think their interests, of course, will and do coincide. At the top line, they are looking for ways to unseat the United States and to also replace the system that emerged from World War II with some system that is not based on the same system of international law. We're all concerned about that from the perspective of authoritarian tyranny dominating the world picture. But I think more to the point, well, it's not more to the point. Everybody has to be concerned about authoritarian tyranny. And I am, of course, very much, but also just again, I come back to that word predictability, the predictability that comes from knowing that you are not subject to kind of criminal action, but you know that your contracts will be fulfilled. It's down to the minor personal things that go on, that your business is not going to be taken over by mafiosi, and instead you have recourse to the rule of law and to courts and to protection of the law. So it's a kind of way of thinking about this battle royal that's going on that gets down to a very fine level of detail. But I do think each of us individually has an interest in it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say in my own way. And so, yes, we must be concerned about China and Russia getting together, because they don't seem to see that individual interest in quite the same way. They are historically much more, I would say, focused on the interests of a collective that is very much governed by the state in each case. So it's a different way of thinking about the future. But I do think that countries across the world, including in the global south, need to think carefully about what they would like the future to hold. And I think having individual rights protected up to the level of the state is an important point. And again, back to the discussion we had earlier about the responsibility of the United States to get that information out there. We haven't done as well as we should, I think, in making that case.
Thanks, Rose. We're coming up to the end of our time here, but I do want to ask you one final question, which relates to an issue that we haven't really properly discussed today, and that is the impact of the war in Ukraine on nuclear non-proliferation. Now, about a year ago, I think there was a lot of alarmism that this conventional war waged under the specter of nuclear escalation could lead to sort of proliferation cascades, make other countries seek the nuclear bomb. And that hasn't really happened. I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence to suggest that it has. And countries that have sort of continued to talk about such weapons are, in fact, US allies who have been talking about this for some time prior to the war. So it's not necessarily causally linked to the invasion of Ukraine. But it seems to me that perhaps Russia, an important partner historically in pursuing nuclear non-proliferation, has perhaps relegated non-proliferation sort of a bit to the back burner. If you look at Russia's role in efforts to restore the JCPOA or its sort of actions on the UN Security Council on the DPRK issue. So I just want to sort of, as a last question, ask you for your take on what's happening in the non-proliferation space and the impact of the Ukraine war on that.
Partially, I see, and I am perhaps being overly hopeful in this regard, but I do see a positive effect in that, again, publics have been awakened to the nuclear threat in a way that they have not been for decades. I have to say my experience as Undersecretary of State working on the non-proliferation treaty review process was it's talking about on the back burner. It was very much on the back burner for a number of nation states that should be more focused on it. A special, I would say, group of experts working in this area and working very, very well to drive forward the non-proliferation treaty efforts in every way they can, but without the kind of top-line attention from governments, the P5 among them, but across the world as well. So I think, and I am hopeful that as we approach this next NPT review cycle, the greater awareness of the reality of the nuclear threat that has emerged out of this war in Ukraine will in fact drive higher level and more focused governmental attention to the necessity of not only nurturing, but also strengthening the NPT and its accompanying non-proliferation regime. At the same time, I am concerned, and I've written about this, that Russia is emerging as a kind of nuclear pariah state or as a very large pariah state with nuclear weapons now, and that they could potentially play an inimical role in the NPT review process and try to put barriers in the way of progress. Of course, the last review cycle, last August, they were the ones who blocked a consensus decision on the final document of the review process. I've had to block a final decision myself back in 2015, so I understand that sometimes dynamics are there that one can't overcome. But in this case, I really thought it was a case of the Russians just not being willing to take a step forward to the rest of the international community who was willing to join consensus at that point. And that is a key difference with 2015, when there were other states who, along with the United States, were concerned about what was happening in that review cycle. So again, we could talk about this much longer, but I do want to end on a bit of a hopeful note to say that I think that the nuclear saber-rattling of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin has produced this result, that it is higher up the agenda of countries around the world, that more countries are focusing on it, and I hope that spells higher level attention in the upcoming review cycle.
Thank you so much, Rose. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. We covered a lot of ground. You covered a lot of ground. I apologize to attendees whose questions we didn't get to in the end. But thank you so much, Rose Gottemoeller, for joining us for this Monterey Conversation today.
It's my pleasure, Hanna. Thank you so much. Great questions. And thank you to the audience for great questions also.